They found the bags on the doorstep before Edmund knocked. That was the detail Marin Holt would turn over for years afterward, the way you turn over a stone that has something living under it. The bags had been packed and set outside before he announced himself, before he raised his fist to the door, which meant he had packed them the night before in the house where they all lived, while his two nieces slept 10 feet away, and he had carried them out in the dark and set them on the frozen step, and then gone back inside to wait for morning. 3 knocks. Heavy. Deliberate. The kind a man uses when he has already made up his mind and does not want an argument. Marin set down the grinding stone. She had been at the kitchen table since first light, working dried corn by hand the way she did every morning, the rhythm of it so familiar she could do it half asleep and often did. The sound of the knock went through the rhythm and stopped it the way a stone stops water. She wiped her hands on her apron and stood. Della was still in bed. Or she was pretending to be. That was a difference between them that almost no one noticed. When trouble announced itself, Della went still. She folded herself into quiet and waited. Marin walked toward it. She opened the door. Edmund Holt stood on the frozen step with his hat pulled low and 4 inches of new snow on the brim, which meant he had been standing outside in the dark for some time before he knocked. He was a large man, broad through the shoulders, with a face that had been weathered past the point of easy reading. He had not always been a hard man. Marin remembered something softer from when she was very small, a version of him that had laughed at the supper table, that had called their mother by a nickname she had long since stopped letting herself remember. But that version had stopped existing somewhere around the time he became responsible for 2 small girls the town had already started watching sideways. At his feet were the 2 bags. "Winter's bad," he said. He was not looking at her face. He was looking somewhere past her left ear at a point on the wall behind her that apparently required his full attention. "Worse than any in 30 years. The stores aren't going to hold for everyone." Marin said nothing. "The council met last night." Still not her face. "3 families have already lost someone to the cold. There's talk the sickness is moving up from the lowlands." "I know," she said. "I told Elder Greer 2 weeks ago that the grain stores had been miscounted. I showed him the numbers." Edmund's jaw shifted. "People don't like being shown numbers, Marin. People are going to be hungry whether they like the numbers or not." "That." He stopped himself, breathed. "That is exactly the kind of thing I'm talking about." He looked at the bags then, made himself look at them. She could see what it cost him, or she could see something. Whether it was guilt or only the effort of holding a decision in place once you'd made it, she couldn't say. They looked similar from the outside. "I packed what I could spare," he said. "Seeds from the fall stores, a good knife, 2 wool blankets, the small axe, a length of rope, a fire kit, enough dried meat for 5 days if you're careful. And if we're not careful, then 3. She looked at him for a long moment, 20 years old in a doorway in the worst winter in living memory. She thought about saying something real, something that might crack through whatever he had constructed around himself to be able to stand on that step and do this thing. She thought about asking whether he remembered the promise he made at their mother's burial, standing in the frozen ground of the Drayfield Cemetery with his hat in his hands and snow in his hair. She didn't ask. There were some questions that had no useful answer. "Let me wake Della," she said, and went back inside. Della was not asleep. She was sitting on the edge of the bed with her boots already on and her coat folded across her lap, her dark eyes steady in the gray light coming through the ice-filmed window. She had heard every word. "How far?" she said. "Far enough that we don't come back." Della looked down at the coat in her hands. For a moment, just a moment, something moved across her face. Then she stood up and put the coat on, and that was the end of it. That was the thing about Della that Marin loved most and found most maddening in equal measure. She made decisions completely and then kept them. No looking backward. Once she moved, she had already moved. They came out together. They always came out together. Edmund was still on the step. On the street behind him, 4 neighbors had arranged themselves in the particular way of people who want to witness something without being seen to want it. Nora Fitch, with her arms folded over her chest. The Langley brothers side by side like a matched pair of weathered fence posts. And old Bert Callow, leaning on his walking stick with an expression that was mostly relief and only a little pity, which told Marin everything she needed to know about what the council meeting had really looked like. These were people who had eaten bread that Marin helped mill, who had taken her recommendations about crop rotation and then credited the improvement to favorable weather, who had brought sick livestock to Della in the dark hours when no one official was watching, because Della had a way with animals that no one could explain and everyone found convenient to use and uncomfortable to acknowledge. Marin picked up one of the bags. It was heavier than she expected, which surprised her. Whatever else Edmund Holt was, he had packed it properly. Della picked up the other without comment. They did not say goodbye. There was not in that moment a goodbye in either of them. Della looked at the four neighbors on the street the way you look at a fence line you have already decided to go around. And Marin looked at her uncle's face one last time, that worn, careful face that was looking somewhere past her left ear again, and she noted the expression she found there and filed it away. Not for revenge. She was not built for revenge. But she wanted to remember exactly what it looked like when someone chose what was easy over what they were supposed to be. Then they turned north into the mountain, into the white. The storm hit them before they cleared the tree line. It had been building since before dawn. Marin had noticed it at first light, that particular stillness that precedes a serious blizzard when the birds stop and the air draws tight and the snow already on the ground seems to brace itself for what is coming. She had noticed it and said nothing because there was nothing useful to say. The storm was coming regardless. They were going into it regardless. The trail north out of Drayfield ran along a frozen creek bed for the first 2 miles before climbing hard into the upper timber. In good weather, it was a serviceable path used by trappers and the occasional land surveyor. In 2 feet of accumulated snow, with fresh powder driving sideways out of the northwest, it was a series of guesses and corrections, each one made against a wind that had decided to have an opinion about everything. Della led. She had always had a better instinct for terrain, some quality of attention that Marin privately thought of as Della reading the ground the way other people read faces. She moved without hesitation, even when hesitation would have been reasonable, planting each step like a small commitment, and Marin followed in her tracks and kept her mind working. She had a map. Technically, it was not her map. It had been among their mother's papers, a hand-drawn geological survey of the upper mountain range, done by a man named Calder Voss, contracted by a mining concern out of the Eastern Territories sometime in the early 1850s. The mining concern had found nothing worth extracting and moved on, and the survey had ended up folded into the back of one of their mother's agricultural notebooks, which was where Marin had found it when she was 16 and had been reading through everything their mother had left behind with the focused intensity of someone looking for a message that might have been left for them. She had read the survey approximately 40 times since then. She had a habit of reading things until they became part of her memory rather than something she needed to refer to. The people of Drayfield had found this deeply unnatural. Marin had found it simply efficient. The map showed, among other geological features, a series of ravines in the upper northwest quadrant of the range. One of them, marked with a notation she had puzzled over for years, was labeled Warm Rock Formation Limestone, possible geothermal. Calder Voss had been looking for ore. He had not been interested in warmth. But Marin had spent 2 years quietly thinking about what that notation might mean in practical terms, the way she tended to think about things that might someday matter, storing them at the back of her mind, like provisions for a journey she hadn't known she would need to take. She was taking it now. "Northeast," she said over the wind, "after the second ridge." Della didn't slow down or turn around. "You're sure?" "I'm sure of the notation. I'm not sure of the translation." "That's honest. It's also not very comforting." "No." They walked for 6 hours. The storm thickened as they climbed the wind-changing direction, twice the temperature, dropping in a way that felt less like weather and more like a decision the mountain had made about them personally. Marin lost feeling in her left hand around the 3rd hour and spent the next mile working it inside her mitten until sensation came back painful and bright. Della had a cut on her chin from a branch that swung back off a snow-heavy pine, and she kept touching it with the back of her hand in the absent way of someone who has already moved past the fact of it. They talked sometimes. Not constantly. They had never been the kind of sisters who needed to fill silence, but in stretches the way you do when the alternative is letting your own thoughts get too loud. "Do you think he packed them the night before or the morning of?" Della said during one of the long, flat sections between ridges. Marin considered this. The snow on his hat brim. He was standing outside before he knocked. He brought the bags out in the dark. Della was quiet. He spent the night in the same house as us, knowing what morning would bring, Marin said. A pause long enough that the wind filled it. Both, Della said finally. I'm both angry and sad, and I can't find the line between them. I don't think there is one. I think that's the part no one tells you about. The first ridge was worse than she had expected. The second was worse than the first. By the time they came down the far slope, the light had gone gray and flat in the way that meant maybe 2 hours before dark, and both of them were moving with the deliberate conservative pace that comes from real exhaustion. Not the kind that asks for sympathy, but the working kind that knows it has to continue regardless. Marin pulled the survey from her coat pocket. The paper was damp at the edges despite the oilskin wrapping, and her fingers were clumsy, but she could read it. She turned it against the failing light and matched what she remembered of Voss's notation to the landscape ahead. Left, she said. Down through those spruce. There should be a drainage channel. Della stopped and looked at the trees. The spruce were old-growth enormous, their lower branches buried under 5 feet of drifted snow so that they rose from the white like columns in something abandoned. How sure are you? More sure than I was an hour ago. The rock formation here matches what Voss drew. He was in this location. The ravine itself I won't know until we're in it. Della studied the trees for 3 seconds. Marin watched her make her decision. Then we go in, she said. They almost missed it. The ravine entrance was not what Marin had pictured. Not a dramatic opening in the earth. Not a visible gap in the rock. It was a narrow slot between 2 limestone faces, half buried in snowdrift, easy to walk past if you weren't looking for something specific in exactly that place. Della spotted it first. She stopped without warning, and Marin nearly walked into her back. Della was looking at the snow in front of the slot, not at the slot itself. Look at the depth, Della said. Marin looked. The snow in front of the slot was shallower than the snow on either side of it, not dramatically, maybe 3 or 4 inches, but consistent over a width of about 6 feet, as if something beneath were affecting the way it settled. Heat, Della said. The word went through Marin like a match struck in a dark room. They pushed through the slot sideways, packs scraping stone, and the ravine opened around them, 40 feet wide at its broadest, maybe more, with limestone walls rising 30 feet on either side, and a floor of compressed earth and old leaf matter. The snow that had entered was thin and patchy, and the air was different, not warm exactly, not the warmth of a fire or a heated room. But the cold was reduced, moderated, like the difference between standing in an open river and standing in a spring-fed pool. The walls held something. The earth below was doing something. Marin dropped to one knee. She pulled off her mitten before she even thought about it and pressed her bare palm flat against the ground. The earth was not cold. She looked up at Della. Della was already looking at her. Neither of them said anything for a moment because what was happening between them and the ground was large enough that words felt premature. You did not narrate a thing like this while you were still confirming it was real. Walk the perimeter, Marin said. They walked it separately, both of them touching the walls, pressing palms to the stone, paying attention. The geothermal effect was not uniform. It was stronger toward the northern end of the ravine, where the limestone went deeper, and the rock face had a faint mineral sharpness that Marin associated with the earth's deeper layers. There was a natural shelf of stone along the west wall that would catch warmth from below and face away from the prevailing wind. There was a depression in the earth near the northern end where last summer's vegetation, dead now but dense and matted, told her the growing season here extended beyond what the elevation should have allowed. And there was tucked deep in the northern alcove where the limestone curved inward on itself the mouth of a larger cave, barely visible. Marin had to press her face close to the wall to see it properly. She reached back and found Della's sleeve without looking. "Here," she said. Della leaned past her and looked into the dark. They needed fire to see how far it went, and if they made fire inside and the ventilation was insufficient, they would know quickly and badly. Della said she would watch the smoke. Marin built the starter from dry material on the cave floor, the undersides of the leaf matter preserved by the warmth coming up through the rock. 3 strikes of the flint and she had a flame. She held it up, watched the smoke. The smoke moved away from them, slowly, deliberately drawn toward the back of the cave. "Ventilation?" Marin said. Natural, Della said from behind her. There's a secondary outlet further in, a fissure in the rock, the warm air circulating. The cave went back further than the firelight could reach. 60 feet, maybe more. The ceiling was high enough to stand upright. The floor was rough, but walkable. The walls were dry. And from somewhere ahead of them, from somewhere in the rock's own deep interior, came the faint and steady warmth that had been there all along, patient and indifferent and entirely real. Della said very quietly, "We're going to live." It was not a question. It was not quite a statement either. It was something between the two, the kind of thing you say when you have held your certainty in reserve for hours because you could not afford to be wrong about it, and now you have enough evidence to let yourself believe. Marin said nothing. She added a piece of dry wood to the fire and let it grow. Outside, the blizzard was eating the world. Snow was burying the path they had walked, the hollow they had left the faces of the people who had watched them go. The mountain was indifferent to all of it, warm in its own hidden places, going about the ancient business of being stone. Inside the cave, the fire caught and held. She allowed herself for just a moment to close her eyes. Then she opened them and began to take stock of what they had. The inventory ran through her mind before she even opened the packs, organized itself the way her mind organized everything methodically without sentiment. 2 wool blankets, 5 days of dried meat, 1 good knife, 1 small axe, a length of rope, a tin cup, the fire kit, the geological survey, and their mother's agricultural notebook, which Marin had added to her own pack at the last moment before leaving, instinctively, before she had fully understood that what was happening was an exile and not a misunderstanding that would resolve itself by afternoon. And the seeds. Edmund had said seeds from the fall stores, and he had not been careless about it. There were folded paper packets of squash, winter rye, turnip, and 1 small paper twist at the very bottom of the pack, smaller than the others, the paper dark with age, the handwriting on the outside not Edmund's but her mother's. Marin held it under the firelight and read what it said. Cave moss. Persistent. She sat with it in her palm for a long time. She did not know whether Edmund had included it deliberately or had simply taken it along with the others without reading the label. She decided, sitting in the entrance of a cave in the upper Bitterroot Range with the worst blizzard in 30 years screaming overhead, that it did not matter. What mattered was that it was here. She turned it over in her fingers. Her mother, Clara Holt, had died when Marin and Della were 7 years old. She had died in November in the house where Edmund still lived, in a bedroom that Marin could still see precisely if she closed her eyes. She had been ill for 3 months before the end, and had spent a portion of those months between the good days and the bad ones doing what she always did when she had something to work through, writing in her notebooks, organizing her seed stores, preparing for seasons. She apparently understood she would not see herself. Marin had found the geological survey 4 years after her mother died, tucked into the back of a notebook on plant cultivation, folded so many times the paper had softened at the creases. She had read it and thought about it and filed it away in the part of her mind where she kept things that might someday matter. She looked at the packet of cave moss in her palm. She looked at the cave around her, at the warmth coming up through the rock, at the limestone walls, at the darkness going back into the mountain further than she could see. Something settled in her chest that was not quite comfort and not quite grief, and was perhaps some combination of the two that didn't have a clean name. Her mother had known. Not everything, not specifically. But she had known something, had felt something about the future of 2 small girls she was leaving behind in the care of a man whose capacity for that responsibility she had perhaps correctly doubted. And she had done what she could with what she had. She had packed things away in the places where they might be found. "Rye first," Della said from across the fire where she had spread the seed packets on the flat stone beside her and was studying them with her practical, assessing eye. If the soil here responds to the geothermal warmth at all, rye has the best germination tolerance for low-light conditions. I know. I wasn't second-guessing you. I was thinking out loud. They sound the same. Della looked at her. Only to you. They worked until they couldn't see, and then they slept, and then they worked again. The first 48 hours were purely practical in the way that emergencies tend to be. There was no time for anything except the immediate problem, and the immediate problems were fire, shelter, water, and an honest assessment of what they had to work with. Marin had the list in her head before they had been in the cave an hour. She ran the inventory again, careful and precise, the way a mill runs grain. 5 days of dried meat. 3 if they were not careful, and they were going to be careful. The axe for wood, the rope for structure, the tin cup for water, the knife for everything a knife is needed for when there is only one knife. The geological survey, which she had now read 41 times and which she kept in her coat pocket where it would stay dry. The agricultural notebook, which was in the pack against the wall, and which contained, among other things, 14 pages of her mother's careful observations on plant medicine, soil amendment, and the cultivation of things that grew in conditions they were not supposed to grow in. And the seeds. 5 packets. One of them very old, written in a hand she would have recognized anywhere. Outside, the blizzard reached its full strength sometime in the second night, and the sound of it against the ravine walls was something between a river and a train, enormous, and sustained a sound that made the silence inside the cave feel less like absence and more like a substance, something with weight and warmth and its own particular texture. Maren lay on her back on a mat of compacted leaf matter and listened to it and felt something she had to examine carefully before she could name it. It was not happiness. Happiness felt like too large a claim for a cave floor in a blizzard, with 5 days of dried meat and an uncertain spring. It was something smaller and more durable than that. It was the feeling of having brought your full capacity to bear on a real problem and found that the capacity was sufficient. The feeling of having used yourself correctly. She had known for years that she could think clearly about difficult things. She had not known until this night whether she could do it when the difficulty was personal and the stakes were her own survival. Now she knew. She turned her head and looked at Della, who was already asleep, breathing slow and even, one hand open on the folded blanket beside her chin. Even in sleep, Della looked ready for whatever came next. It was the most enviable quality Maren could imagine. She looked back at the cave ceiling. The fire was steady. The seeds were in their packets, safe in the pack against the wall. The mountain was warm in its hidden places. She closed her eyes. There was work to do in the morning. There was always work to do in the morning. But the morning was not yet, and the cave was holding its warmth around her like something that had been waiting patient as limestone for someone to find it and put it to use. Outside, the storm continued its long and indifferent work. Inside, 2 sisters slept. The work began before they had names for what they were building. That was how Maren would remember it later. Not as a plan that was executed, but as a series of necessary things done in the necessary order, each one revealing the next, the way a path reveals itself when you are already walking it. There was no moment when she stood back and said, "This is what we are making." There was only the next problem and the problem after that, and the slow accumulation of solutions that eventually became something you could call a life. The shelter came first because it had to. The cave entrance faced northwest, and while the ravine walls blocked the worst of the wind, a sustained blizzard found angles that a ravine could not anticipate, and the temperature inside the cave dropped sharply at night, even with the geothermal warmth rising from the rock below. They needed something between themselves and the entrance, something that would hold heat without holding smoke. Maren spent the second morning in the ravine with the axe working a stand of dead birch she found against the eastern wall. The birch had died in place and dried where it stood, which meant the wood was light and workable, and would split cleanly, which was either good fortune or the kind of thing that happens when geothermal ground alters the natural processes of decomposition in ways a living forest would not. She did not spend time analyzing it. She cut what she could and dragged it inside. Della spent the same morning pulling stones from the ravine floor and stacking them along the natural shelf on the west wall, beginning the base of a windbreak. She worked without comment, fitting each stone against the next with the focused patience of someone who understood that the quality of the foundation would determine everything built above it. They were not carpenters. Maren said so directly. "We're not trying to be carpenters," Della said, fitting a cross brace between 2 upright birch stakes with a length of rope she had cut into thirds. "We're trying to make a structure that doesn't fall on us while we sleep. Those are different goals. The left wall is 2 inches out of plumb. Then we'll lean everything to the right, stop watching me, and start on the roof." The roof was branches, laid dense and overlapping, weighted with flat stones propped at an angle against the cave wall to shed moisture. It would not have impressed anyone who had studied construction. It kept the wind off their sleeping place and held in the warmth from the fire below it, which was what it needed to do. The first night they slept under it, Marin lay on her back and stared at the rough ceiling above her and felt something she had to work to identify. She kept turning it over, checking it from different angles. It was satisfaction, not happiness. Happiness was a different animal, and she was not going to claim it in the second week of an exile in a cave with 5 days of dried meat that were already down to 3. But satisfaction was not the same as happiness. Satisfaction was the feeling of having used yourself correctly, of having brought your full capacity to bear on a real problem and found it sufficient. She thought it might be the only feeling that could honestly coexist with terrible circumstances, because it did not require the circumstances to be good. It only required that you had done something real with them. She closed her eyes and slept better than she had in months. The soil work began on day 4. Marin had known from the first night that the Northern Depression was the site. The dead vegetation there told her the growing season at this elevation extended beyond what it should, which meant the geothermal gradient was consistent and deep enough to matter. But knowing the site and being able to use it were two separate problems. The native earth was cold, compacted, clay-heavy, nearly impermeable. Useful for holding heat, useless for roots. It needed amendment, significant amendment. She spent 3 days moving material. Limestone grit chipped from the cave walls with the axe fine enough to work into the soil without disrupting drainage. Organic matter from the ravine floor, the leaf debris and compressed plant material that the warmth had preserved through winter. Fire ash mixed with water in the tin cup introduced in layers to moderate the pH toward something a seed could use. Della worked the material in with her hands pressing and turning in the focused, unhurried way of someone who understood that speeding this process would make it longer, not shorter. "My hands are going to look like my grandmother's by spring," she said on the second day, not complaining exactly, more observing. "They already look like a working woman's hands," Marin said from behind the axe. "That's not the same thing." "In every useful way it is." Della flicked a piece of limestone grit in her direction. Marin ducked without looking up. They planted the winter rye on day 7. 12 seeds to the square foot, shallower than ideal because the soil was not yet deep enough for standard depth, positioned close to the warmest section of the wall where the geothermal gradient was most consistent. The turnip went further out in the cooler outer rows where root vegetables would benefit from the temperature differential. The squash they held back entirely. Squash needed more space and more established soil, and they would not have that until the rye had come up and its root system had begun the slow work of loosening the clay beneath. The cave moss they planted last in a shallow channel scratched into the base of the warmest wall. Their mother had written in her notebook that cave moss required less soil and less water than almost anything else she had cultivated, that it was above all else persistent. She had underlined the word. It was unusual for her to underline anything. Then they waited. Waiting was its own kind of work. They were never passive. There was too much to do for passive. But the days had a different quality now, with the planting done a suspended quality, like the moment after you have committed to something and before you know whether it will hold. They improved the shelter, built a stone-lined channel to redirect a seep of groundwater from the eastern wall into a usable collection point, mapped the full interior of the cave and found it went back 112 feet with a secondary chamber that caught better light from a fissure overhead during midday hours. They talked, more than they had in years. Years in Drayfield, where they had learned to be careful about what they said, and to whom where conversation had become navigation around obstacles rather than the thing itself. Here there were no obstacles except the ones the cave presented, and those were physical and therefore honest. Their mother came up more than once. She would have hated the soil quality, Della said one evening watching the fire work down to coals. She would have spent the first week writing complaints about the alkaline content. Della laughed. Real this time, full and unguarded. And then she'd have fixed it. And then she'd have fixed it, Marin agreed. A silence settled that had texture to it. Not quite grief, not quite something else. "I think she was afraid of Edmund," Della said. "Not for herself, for us. Afraid of what he would do with us if she was gone." Marin looked at the coals. "She prepared us. The notebooks. The survey." "I think she knew something." Marin paused. "Not everything, but something." Neither of them said anything else for a long while. and the fire did its slow, patient work, and the cave held its warmth around them, and outside the mountain continued its ancient and indifferent business of being stone. On the 18th day, Maren found the first rye seedling. She almost missed it. She had been checking the plot by firelight before dawn, running her fingers along the soil surface the way she did every morning, and she felt it before she saw it. A small resistance. She moved the firelight closer and crouched down, and there it was. A single pale shoot the size of her thumbnail leaning sideways toward the faint gray brightness of the cave entrance, but alive. Genuinely, unmistakably alive in ground that by any reasonable calculation should not have supported it. She sat back on her heels. She called Della over without saying what she had found, just her name quietly. And Della came and crouched beside her and looked at the seedling for a long time without speaking. Then she stood up and moved the polished tin reflector they had rigged against the wall, angling it 10 degrees further toward the growing plot. "It needs more light," she said. "I know." That was all either of them said. It was enough. Then day 23 arrived and took everything they had built and threatened to end it before it had properly begun. The seep channel along the eastern wall had been running steadily since they built the collection basin on day 5. It was their only reliable source of water in the cave, a thin but consistent flow of groundwater that seeped through a natural fracture in the limestone and ran down the wall face into the stone-lined basin they had built below. Maren had checked it every morning. It had been utterly dependable. On the morning of day 23, it was not running. She stood at the basin for a long moment, telling herself she was mistaken, that the flow had simply slowed. Then she ran her fingers along the wall above the basin and felt nothing. Dry stone. She pressed her palm flat against the fracture and felt nothing moving beneath it. The seep had stopped. She turned and looked at the growing plot. 7 rye seedlings, now pale and determined, leaning toward the reflector. Without water, they would begin to fail within a day. By the second day, they would not recover. Della was already at the wall when Maren turned around. "How bad?" Della said. "A blockage somewhere above the fracture. Probably a limestone shift from the temperature change overnight." Maren pressed her ear to the wall. Very faintly she could hear water, not absent, moving somewhere above, unable to find its way through. "It's still there. It just can't get out." "Then we open it away." They worked for 19 hours. There was no good tool for it. The axe was too blunt for precise work on limestone and too heavy to control in a tight space. Maren sharpened one of the birch offcuts into a point and used it as a chisel, driving it with the back of the axe handle in careful, measured strikes, working along the fracture line above the blockage, trying to find the point where pressure would open rather than collapse the channel. Della worked above her on a platform of stacked stones, clearing the loose material. Maren chipped free, keeping the work area open, watching the wall for signs that they were making progress or making things worse. They did not talk much. There was no energy for it. What they had was fully committed to the work. It was somewhere in the 14th hour that Maren's right hand began to shake. Not from cold. From sustained gripping from hours of driving the birch point against limestone with a force that had long since exceeded what her hand wanted to provide. She felt the tremor and tightened her grip and kept going. She did not know exactly when it happened. There was a strike that felt different from the others, a quality of give that the stone had not offered before, and then a sound like something releasing, and then the water came. Not a flood. Just the seep restored, running down the wall face in its familiar thin thread, finding the basin below, with the indifferent accuracy of water finding its level. Maren lowered her arms. She pressed her back against the opposite wall and sat down on the cave floor and looked at the water running and did not say anything for a while. Her right hand was bleeding along an old callus line where the birch point had pressed too hard for too long. She had not noticed. Della came down from the stone platform and sat beside her. She did not say anything either for a moment. Then she took a strip of cloth from the hem of her underlayer and wrapped Maren's hand without ceremony, pulling the binding snug and tucking the end under with the quick competence of someone who is not particularly gentle but is very precise. She handed Maren the tin cup filled from the restored basin. Maren drank it. Outside, the blizzard that had been gathering for 2 days broke over the mountain in full. The wind hit the ravine walls and screamed over them and drove new snow into drifts that would reach the second branches of the spruce by morning. The cold locked down everything that could be locked. Inside the cave, the water ran in its channel. The seedlings survived, Caleb Vane found them on the 47th day. Della heard him first. She had gone out in the early afternoon to check the snare line she had been running along the ravine's eastern edge, resetting the two that a fox had learned to trip without consequence, and she was crouched over the furthest snare when she heard it. Footsteps on the ravine rim above. The distinct compression of a person's weight on packed snow, deliberate and unhurried, moving west along the top edge. She was on her feet and moving back toward the cave entrance before the second footfall. She put her head through the slot. "Someone's outside." Marin looked up from the notebook. "Person?" "Definitely person, moving along the rim. Hasn't found the entrance." Marin was on her feet. She picked up the knife, not as a weapon exactly, but as an object that focused thinking. "One. Sounds like one. Heavy step." She set the knife back down. "Let's go out. If we choose the moment we're not being found, we're introducing ourselves." Della pulled on her coat. "That's a meaningful difference." "I think so." They came out of the slot together, which had always unsettled people in Drayfield. The two of them appearing simultaneously from the same direction at the same pace, with the same expression, which at that moment was direct and cautious and not in any way welcoming. The figure on the rim above stopped. He was young. Younger than the heavy footfall suggested, maybe 22 or 23, thin, in the specific way of someone who had been in deep snow for weeks, which starts at the face and works inward. He wore good winter gear, better than most in Drayfield could have managed, canvas long coat over heavy flannel layers, fur-brimmed hat, high leather boots. A rifle slung over one shoulder, both hands visible. Marin noted the hands. He looked at them for a moment with an expression she recognized as raw surprise, the kind that happens when reality arrives differently from the expectation you have been carrying for some time. "You're alive," he said. He said it the way you say something you had already decided to believe but had not been certain of until this exact second. "Clearly," Della said. "Most people figured you were dead after the first week of that storm." "Most people were wrong," Marin said. "Who are you?" He seemed to need a moment to organize himself. "Caleb Vane. I trapped the upper northwest line. 3 seasons now." A pause. "I'm not from Drayfield." "Then how do you know about us?" The story came out in pieces. Heard Holt's version first, then other versions. I was running my line and I kept thinking about it. He looked at the ravine, then at the slot behind them, then back at them. "I didn't really expect to find you. I just didn't want to go back to my cabin without looking." The three of them stood in the narrow ravine with the wind doing its work overhead. Marin looked at him the way she looked at most things she was trying to understand, steadily and without particular hurry. He held the look without flinching. That was something. "How is the town?" she said. Something shifted behind his expression. Went quieter. "Bad," he said. "It's bad." She looked at Della. Della looked back. "Come in out of the cold," Marin said. "We'll make broth." He blinked. Then he came down the ravine wall, carefully testing each foothold, and she led him through the slot and into the warmth. He stopped just inside the entrance. Stood very still. She watched him take it in. The fire, the shelter structure with its rough roof and stone windbreak. The growing plot, the 7 rye seedlings visible even from the entrance, pale and purposeful and leaning toward the polished tin reflector. The stone-lined water channel, the tool wall, the 2 sleeping mats on either side of the fire, all of it. He said nothing for a long time. "You built all this," he said finally, "not a question." "We had time," Della said, and put water on for broth. He sat across the fire and drank the weak broth and told them what he knew about Drayfield. The grain stores were lower than the council had admitted publicly. 2 of the older families had lost people to the cold in the first month. The hunting had been poor, the trappers on the lower lines bringing in less than half a normal season. Edmund Holt had not spoken publicly about his nieces since the morning they left. Not to defend himself, not to explain. He simply did not speak of them, and the town seemed content to treat that silence as the end of the matter. Marin listened to all of it without commenting. Della watched the fire. Then Caleb said something he had clearly been carrying for some time without knowing where to put it. He said that after he heard what had happened, the full account of it, he had been angry in a way that had nowhere to go because it wasn't his town and they weren't his people, and there was nothing he could usefully do with the feeling. "So I looked," he said simply. Marin was quiet for a moment. She was looking at the rye seedlings, 7 of them now. The oldest was nearly 2 inches tall. "When you come through next time," she said, "bring empty sacks if you have them. We'll have rye to send back with you." Caleb looked at the seedlings. He looked at them the way Marin had looked at the first one on the 18th morning, with the particular expression of someone watching something exist that they were not entirely certain was allowed to exist. "You're going to feed the town," he said. "We're going to try. Come back in 10 days. Bring the sacks." He looked at the rye one more time, then at her. "I'll be here in 8, he said. He was, and he brought 4 empty grain sacks folded flat in his pack, and a small parcel of salt wrapped in oilskin that he set on the stone shelf beside the fire without comment, the way you leave something for people without wanting to make a production of generosity. The rye was not ready yet. He had known it wouldn't be. He had done the arithmetic on the trail back to his cabin and understood that 2-inch seedlings needed more than 8 days to become harvestable grain. But he came anyway. He spent 2 hours helping Della shore up the secondary chamber's eastern wall where the limestone had been shedding small chips onto the outer rye bed. He worked with his hands in the direct, unpretentious way of someone who has spent years making do in remote places without waiting to be asked, and without overstating what he had done afterward. When he left, Della said, "He's all right." "He is," Marin said. "I didn't expect him to come back." "I did. He said 8 days and he meant it. People who mean what they say usually come back." She made a mark in the notebook recording the rye height, 3.5 inches now in the main plot. "It's a small category of people, worth noticing when you find one." He came back 4 more times over the following 3 weeks, and each time the cave was further along than the last, and each time there was something that needed a 3rd pair of hands, and he had them. The rye in the main plot reached harvest height on his 4th visit. Not a full harvest, not the dense, thick-stalked yield of an open field, but enough. Enough for the purpose they had in mind. Della cut it with the skinning knife while Marin held the stems, and Caleb watched from the entrance of the secondary chamber with the stillness of someone who does not have the right words for what they are witnessing, and has the good sense not to reach for wrong ones. "How much?" he said. Marin weighed the cut stalks in her hands. "Enough for a small loaf. Maybe more if the grain fills out the way I think it will." She looked up at him. "Who in town is worst off?" He did not hesitate. "The Pruitt family. 4 children, youngest not yet 2. And Marta Greer, she's been on charity since her husband died in October, and the people helping her are running low themselves." "Start there," Marin said. "Don't tell anyone where it came from." He looked at her. "They'll figure it out eventually," he said. "Eventually is fine. Right now I want the food to get there before anyone decides they have feelings about the source. Let the child eat first. The feelings can wait." He was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded once and took the grain carefully, the way you carry something that cost more than its weight. "I'll go tonight," he said. "The weather will hold until morning." "It will," Della said from the corner without looking up. "Pressure's been steady for 3 days. You have a window." Caleb looked at Della, then at Marin. Marin returned his look with an expression that said, "Yes, she's always like this, and yes, she's right, and no, there's no particular explanation for it." He pulled on his coat. 3 weeks later, Caleb arrived a full day ahead of schedule. He came through the entrance slot with more speed than his usual pace, and his face, when he stepped into the firelight, had the careful, over-controlled look of a man who has been rehearsing difficult news on a long walk and has not yet decided how much of the rehearsal to use. Marin put down the notebook. "What happened?" He pulled off his hat. "Sickness in town. Real sickness, not just cold and hunger. Something moving through the families. Started with the Langley household 4 days ago. By yesterday, 5 more families had it. Fever mostly. The youngest Pruitt girl." He sat down heavily on the stone shelf. "And Mrs. Aldine. She's one of the sick ones." The name settled into the cave with particular weight. Mrs. Theda Aldine was the only person in Drayfield with any formal knowledge of medicine or plant treatment. If she was sick, the town had no one. Marin looked at the cave wall. She was running through the notebook in her mind. Her mother's 14 pages on plant medicine, the careful observations accumulated over years of quiet experimentation. She had read them so many times she could recite them. She stood up and went to the pack and took out the notebook and found the page. Cave moss. Antipyretic properties when prepared as a concentrated reduction. Effective for fever management when administered consistently. Not a cure, a support. Buys time for the body to do its own work. And below that, in her mother's handwriting, a note about yarrow. Its value in combination with moss reduction for respiratory fever. The preparation method. The dosage. Marin looked up at the north wall where the moss colony had been spreading steadily for weeks. A slow, dark green advance across the limestone that their mother's notebook had said would by spring provide a continuous, harvestable surface. She looked at Della. Della was already looking at her. She had been looking at her since Caleb said the youngest Pruitt girl. "The yarrow," Marin said. "It's in the seed stores. I found it in week 2 and set it aside. I didn't say anything because we didn't need it yet." Caleb looked between them. "You have medicine." "We have what's needed for fever management if the preparation is done correctly." Marin was already moving to the supply stores, already calculating quantities against what Caleb had described, already running the numbers on duration and dosage, the way she ran every number forward and backward until she was certain. "But Caleb," he looked at her, "this time you have to tell them the truth. All of it. Where it comes from, who prepared it, exactly what it is. They need to know the source is reliable. They need to know the dosage is not guesswork. Mrs. Aldine needs to read the preparation notes herself, not have them interpreted for her." He was quiet. "It was going to come out anyway," she said. "The grain alone. The quantities don't make sense without an explanation. It was always going to come out." "I know," he said. "I know that. I was just hoping to wait until I thought people were ready." "People are sick," Della said simply. "Ready is not the current concern." He looked at them both for a moment, the look of a man trying to calculate a reaction he cannot fully predict. Then he nodded. "Tell me what to bring and how to carry it," he said. "And tell me what to say to Mrs. Aldine." Marin picked up the notebook and turned to the page her mother had written and began to prepare what the town needed, working with the quiet efficiency of someone who had spent 61 days learning exactly what she was capable of and had stopped being surprised by the answer. The reaction in Drayfield to the truth did not arrive all at once. Caleb brought it back in pieces over the following days, and Marin assembled those pieces into a picture the way she assembled most things methodically, without letting the weight of individual details distort the overall shape. The medicine had reached the sick families first, which was all that mattered in the immediate term. Mrs. Aldine, recovering slowly from her own fever, had looked at the prepared moss compound and the dried yarrow and the dosage notes written in Marin's tight, economical hand, and had told Caleb that whoever wrote these notes knew what they were doing, and she wanted to know who. When he told her, she had not said much. Just looked at the notes again and said well in a tone that apparently covered a great deal of ground. The families who had been receiving food already suspected. The Pruitt mother had said when Caleb confirmed it that she had known for weeks and had been grateful and did not see why anything needed to change. The harder reactions came from other quarters. Elder Greer had gone to his house and not come out for a day and a half. The Langley brothers, whose voices had been among the loudest on the morning of the exile, had gone very quiet in the specific way of men who cannot locate their anger when the thing they are angry about is keeping their children alive. And Edmund Holt had stood in the middle of the main street of Drayfield and listened to Caleb tell the full account and had not said a single word the entire time. And then had walked home. The people who watched him said afterward that he walked like a man carrying something too heavy to put down and too heavy to keep holding. Marin wrote none of this in the notebook. She kept it in her head where it lived alongside everything else she kept there. The geological survey, the soil amendment ratios, the rye germination counts, the face her uncle had made on a January morning when he had looked at the air beside her ear instead of her eyes. She let it sit. She did not sort it yet. Della said on the evening after Caleb's account, "Are you all right?" "I'm thinking." "I know. That's why I'm asking." Marin looked at the fire. "I keep trying to find one clean feeling about it. Just one. But there's too much in the way." "Like what?" "Like the fact that I'm glad the Pruitt girl is better. Genuinely glad. And I can hold that at the same time as being angry about January, and neither one cancels the other out, and I don't know what to do with that." Della was quiet for a moment. "You don't have to do anything with it. You can let them both be true at the same time. Mama said something like that once. After the business with the mill council, when they used Papa's assessment without crediting him. Della looked at the fire. She said you can be right and angry and generous all at the same time, and none of those things is a contradiction. Marin remembered it vaguely. She had been 12, maybe 13, and had not fully understood it then. She understood it better now. Edmund Holt appeared at the top of the ravine on the 107th day. Marin was in the secondary chamber adjusting the light reflector when Della's voice came from the main cave level, and careful in the way it got when she was managing something she had not fully assessed yet. "Marin, come here." She came. Della was standing just inside the entrance slot looking up. Marin looked up. He was at the rim. Alone. Moving with the effortful, committed gait of someone running on decision rather than energy. Each step deliberate in a way that had nothing to do with the terrain and everything to do with the will required to keep placing one foot in front of the other when you had been doing something difficult for a very long time. He looked worse than she had expected. Not from the cold, he was dressed adequately, heavy wool coat and fur-collared hat and leather gloves, but from the inside. His face had gone the gray-yellow of a man who had not been sleeping, and he had lost weight in the way that happened to large men who stopped eating properly, which made him look simultaneously larger and diminished as if the frame were still there, but something essential had left it. He saw them. He stopped. The three of them held that position for a moment that felt longer than it was. The two women at the cave entrance looking up, the man at the ravine rim looking down, the mountain doing its indifferent business all around them in the gray midwinter light. He started down the wall. He was not graceful about it. He slipped twice on the descent and caught himself both times with his hands, and by the time he reached the ravine floor, his palms were scraped, and he was breathing harder than the exertion warranted. He walked toward them and stopped about 6 feet away. He looked at the ravine, the entrance slot. The compressed snow floor marked with their foot traffic, the faint warmth perceptible even out here if you stood still and paid attention. He looked at them. "There are 3 children running high fevers," he said. "Mrs. Aldine is better but not strong enough to tend them all. We've used everything she had." "We know," Marin said. "Caleb told us." He looked at her face fully, which he had not done in January. She let him. "I'm not going to stand here and explain myself," he said. He stopped. His jaw worked. "I know what I did. I'm not going to pretend otherwise." Another pause longer. "I'm asking for the families, not for me." The cave was warm behind her. The rye was growing. The squash sat heavy and useful on the secondary chamber floor. Marin felt all of it at her back while she looked at this man who had packed 2 bags the night before he sent them into the worst blizzard in 30 years. She felt the things she had been letting sit unsorted since Caleb first spoke his name, and she felt it clarify. Not into forgiveness exactly, not yet, and perhaps not ever in any complete sense, but into something that was beside the point of forgiveness. Something more practical and perhaps more honest than that. "Come inside," she said. "We'll put together what we have." He had not expected it to be that simple. She could see that clearly. He had come prepared for something harder and had not known what to do with the absence of it. "Come in," she said again more quietly and stood aside. He came through the slot. He walked into the cave slowly and the warmth took him, the way warmth takes cold people gradually and perceptibly, his shoulders coming down from where they had been locked near his ears. He looked at everything. He looked for a long time at the growing plots, the rye and the turnips, and the moss colony spreading green and purposeful along the entire northern wall. He looked at the shelter structure with its rough roof and stone windbreak. He looked at the 2 sleeping mats, the water channel, the tool wall, the tin cup on its hook. On the stone shelf beside the fire sat a small loaf of bread, dense and dark, cooling from the morning's baking. The first proper loaf they had made from the second harvest set aside, because Marin had wanted to confirm the grain-to-flour ratio before committing the full yield to it. Edmund looked at the bread for a long moment. He began to say something and stopped. Then he tried again more carefully, like a man selecting from a supply that had run low. "I packed those bags the night before," he said, "while you were sleeping. I want you to know that I understood what I was doing. I'm not going to stand here and pretend I didn't understand." Marin set down the squash she had been wrapping. She looked at him fully. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because saying I'm sorry isn't enough. I know it isn't enough, and I didn't want to say it and have you think I believed it was enough. The cave was quiet, except for the small sounds of the fire and Della moving through the supply stores with her quick, precise hands. Marin held his look for a long moment. She thought about the first ridge in the blizzard and the second ridge worse than the first. She thought about 18 days waiting for a rye seedling and what that waiting had felt like in the body, in the specific wait of each morning before the plot showed her anything. She thought about 19 hours against a limestone wall with a sharpened stick and a hand that bled along an old callous line. She thought about her mother's notebook in the pack 3 feet away, which she had read so many times she could recite it in the dark. He was right that it was not enough. He was also right that saying so was more honest than pretending it was. I know it's not enough, she said. I'm not waiting for enough. She picked up the squash and kept rapping. Help me carry these to the entrance. He stood and came to help, and for the next 20 minutes they worked in the same space without speaking, and it was not comfortable and not resolved and was not pretending to be either of those things, which was Marin thought the most they could honestly manage right now. And honesty was what she had. Della worked quickly and without waste, measuring the moss compound into portions on a flat stone, wrapping each one in sections of oilskin, labeling the dosage in charcoal on the outside of each packet in her clear, unhurried hand. She had the preparation done before Marin had finished packing the food stores. That was Della. She had already decided what needed doing and had been doing it before anyone announced it. Edmund sat and watched them work. He did not offer to help until Marin asked him to, which was the most honest thing he did in that hour. He seemed to understand that the work between the two sisters had been calibrated over 107 days to a precision that an unfamiliar hand would only interrupt. When Caleb arrived at the rim 20 minutes later, having tracked Edmund's trail from the hollow and correctly predicted its destination, the 4 of them loaded everything that could be prepared. Edmund carried 3 sacks. Caleb carried the rest. They went out of the ravine together, moving with the particular urgent economy of people who understand that what they are carrying matters to specific named individuals and that speed therefore has weight. Della watched them go from the entrance slot. He's not going to be all right for a long time, she said. No, Marin agreed. Are you? Marin thought about it honestly, the way she thought about most things. I don't know yet. Ask me in the spring. She paused. I meant what I said to him. I'm not waiting for enough. I don't have the energy for it, and I don't want to spend what I have on it. That's not the same as being all right. No, Della said. It's not the same. But it's workable. I can work with that. Della seemed to accept this. She went back inside. Marin stood at the entrance a moment longer and looked up at the strip of sky visible above the ravine walls, gray and close and cold, and then she went back in too. Caleb came 7 days later, and his face when he came through the slot was not carrying bad news. It was carrying something more complicated than that, something that required a moment to read correctly. The children, Marin said immediately. Fever broke in all 3, the Pruitt girl on day 3, the other 2 on day 4. He sat down. He looked tired in the deep way that comes from a stretch of days that asked more than they had any right to. Mrs. Aldine said the compound was the best she had worked with, given what was available. She wants to know where you learned the preparation. Our mother's notes. 14 years of her own observation and experimentation. I told her something like that. He reached into his coat and withdrew a small object wrapped in cloth and set it on the stone shelf beside the fire with the deliberate care of someone who has been entrusted with something and takes the trust seriously. Edmund asked me to bring this. Neither sister moved for a moment. Then Della walked over and picked it up and unwrapped it, and Marin watched her sister's face do something she had not seen it do in a very long time. A sudden softness, quick and unguarded there and then, controlled in the way Della controlled most things efficiently and without drama. Della held it out. It was a sketchbook. Small, cloth-bound soft at the corners, from years of handling the cover, stained at the lower right with something that might have been soil or might have been clay. Marin knew it before she touched it. She had last seen it on the shelf beside her mother's bed the morning of the funeral 13 years ago, when Edmund had been moving through the house with the purposeful numbness of a man dealing with objects because he could not deal with what the objects meant. She had thought it was gone. She took it from Della and held it, and did not open it immediately. The cloth cover was exactly as she remembered. Faded at the spine, softened along the edges, carrying in its texture the specific weight of her mother sitting by the window in the late afternoon light, drawing in the focused and contented silence of someone doing the thing they did best. She opened it. Her mother had sketched everything. Plants and early growth root systems carefully exposed and labeled in her small handwriting. The mountain visible from the house window in 3 different seasons, each version slightly different in line, as if she had been studying how it changed rather than simply recording that it existed. A drawing of Marin at perhaps 8 years old, caught in profile at the kitchen table with something open in front of her and her feet bare on the floor, rendered with the affectionate precision of someone who finds the ordinary world deeply interesting. Several pages of soil cross-sections annotated. A drawing of Della asleep, very young, one hand open on the pillow. And on the last used page in pencil, a sketch of the mountain's upper range. The northwest quadrant. The ravines. The limestone formations. The particular slot between 2 rock faces that Marin would have recognized anywhere, drawn with the careful accuracy of someone who had stood at that location and paid attention to exactly what was there. Beside it, in the same pencil, 2 words, "They'll find it." Marin stared at those words for a long time. She thought about the cave moss seeds in their paper, twist her mother's handwriting on the outside. She thought about the geological survey folded into the back of the agricultural notebook. She thought about 14 pages of plant medicine, written with the thoroughness of someone who intended for those pages to be used by someone else in conditions she was trying to prepare for without being able to say so directly. She thought about her mother at the window in the late afternoon light. She closed the sketchbook. "She knew," she said. Her voice was steady, but only because she was using the kind of steadiness kept in reserve for things that would otherwise be too much. "She knew we would need it. All of it. She prepared us for something she hoped would never happen." "Yes," Della said softly. Marin pressed her hand flat on the cover of the sketchbook for a moment. Then she placed it carefully in the pack beside the notebook and straightened up and looked at Caleb, who had been sitting very still with the particular tact of someone who understands when they are in the presence of something private. "What is the state of the town now?" she said. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Surviving better than 2 weeks ago. The food made a real difference to the worst-off families, but there's still hunger and cold, and people have been inside their own heads for a long winter, which makes them—" He paused. "Brittle." "What are they saying?" "There's talk about bringing the town's remaining seed stores up here to the cave. Not an official proposal, more like people talking around the edges of what they actually mean, which is that you know something they don't, and they want to know it too." He watched her face. The Pruitt family, Mrs. Aldine, a few of the younger households. Marin looked at Della. Della looked back. "They'd have to do the work themselves," Marin said. "We can teach the method, but we can't run a second operation from here. They'd need to identify their own site, prepare their own soil. It takes weeks before you can plant anything." "I know. I think they know. And they'd need to accept that what we tell them is based on actual assessment of actual conditions. It can't be filtered through Elder Greer deciding what sounds reasonable to him." "Elder Greer," Caleb said carefully, "has been quieter than usual." "Good. He can stay quiet." She was thinking now that particular quality of focus that meant the practical part of her had taken over from everything else. "The upper meadow south of town. There's a limestone shelf with a partial overhang. If the soil underneath is what I think it is based on the survey, it could support a cold frame operation above ground by late March. Smaller than this, but faster to establish because of direct light." Della said, "You'd need a soil assessment first." "Yes, which means someone goes to the meadow." A pause. "Or someone from town comes here." The 2 statements landed with their full weight and stayed there. Della said after a moment, "Let them come here. Let them see it. Not just receive the food and the medicine and the instructions on paper." Her voice was not hard. It was clear. "People understand what they can see. Let them see what was built and what it took." Marin thought about Edmund walking into the cave and standing in front of the growing plots with the expression of a man finally understanding what he had asked them to walk into. She thought about Caleb on his first visit, standing at the entrance with his hands in his pockets and his face doing something between disbelief and wonder. "You're right," she said. "I know. Don't be smug about it. I'm not being smug. I'm being right. Those are different things. Marin looked at Caleb. Tell whoever is talking to send 2 people up here in 5 days. Working people. People who will actually listen, not the council. Aldous Pruitt knows soil, Caleb said. Farmed lowland before he came up here. Good. Him and 1 other. And tell them they're coming to learn not to be helped. Those are different things, and I want them clear on which one this is before they arrive. He nodded. He stood and did what he had started doing around the 3rd visit without anyone asking or commenting on it, took a quick inventory of what was low in the supply area. Made a mental list would bring what he could on the next run. The work itself had become the thank you. Neither sister said anything about it because there was nothing to say. At the entrance, he paused. Edmund asked me something, he said, not turning around. Whether you'd ever come back down to Drayfield. The cave was very quiet. What did you tell him? Marin said. I told him that was yours to decide. And he said yes, that's all. Just yes. He went out through the slot, and his footsteps faded up the ravine wall and then were gone. Marin sat by the fire for a long time after. The sketchbook was in the pack. The rye was in its bed. The mountain was doing its slow, permanent work above and around them, warm in its hidden places, indifferent as ever to the small human arrangements taking place within it. She thought about her mother's pencil moving across the last page of that sketchbook, the careful sketch of the Northwest Ravine, the 2 words written beside it with the calm certainty of someone who has already decided what she believes. They'll find it, past tense in its certainty, written before the finding. The love in it was practical enough to look ahead, to prepare for a future it hoped would never be needed, and to do so without flinching from what that preparation implied. Della said from across the fire without looking up from the moss she was harvesting. I know what you're thinking. I know you do. And Marin looked at the fire. Spring is coming. Della was quiet for a moment, then softly, yes, it is. Aldous Pruitt arrived 5 days later with a younger man named Pell Dancy, who had the hands of someone who had worked ground since he was old enough to hold a tool, and the expression of someone who had been told to listen before he spoke and was making a genuine effort at it. Pruitt stopped just inside the cave entrance and did what everyone did, went still and felt the warmth and looked at the growing plots. But he did it differently from the others. He crouched down beside the main rye bed without asking, and pressed 2 fingers into the soil at the plot edge and worked them to the 2nd knuckle, and drew them out and rubbed the soil between his fingers and looked at it. You amended this heavy, he said. The native soil was clay-dense, Marin said. High alkaline content from the limestone, 6 weeks of amendment before the rye germinated reliably. What did you use? Limestone particulate from the wall, organic matter from the ravine floor, fire ash mixed with water for pH balance. She paused. The geothermal gradient handles the temperature. The amendment work is for nutrient content and drainage, 2 separate problems. He looked up at her. He was a straightforward man in his early 40s with a face that showed its history clearly. Hard seasons and harder winters, and more recently the specific weathering of a man who had watched his youngest child sick with fever and had been unable to do anything useful about it. I owe you an apology, he said. He said it plainly without performance, looking directly at her. My family was on that street in January. I didn't say anything. Marin looked at him. Stop trying to live with it and do something useful with it instead, she said, not unkindly, just directly. You're here. That's a start. Learn this, take it back, teach it to everyone who will listen. That's more useful than living with it. He held her look. Yes, ma'am, he said, and there was nothing in it but simple recognition, the way you say it to someone who has just said the truest thing in the room. They got to work. She taught him for 2 full days, walking him and Pell through everything. The amendment ratios, the planting depths, the reflector system, the moss cultivation, the logic of geothermal identification in limestone formations, the germination markers, what healthy root development looked like against what it looked like when something was wrong. She taught it the way her mother had taught her things, without condescension, with high expectations, with the specific generosity of someone who believes that knowledge becomes more valuable when it is shared, not less. Pell Dancy, who had been quiet through most of the first day, asked his first question on the morning of the 2nd. It was a good question, specific and practical, about whether amendment ratios needed to change for a south-facing site with different drainage characteristics. Marin answered it fully and then asked him one back about the soil conditions at the meadow site, and he answered with more precision than she had expected, and they spent the next hour going back and forth in the focused way of two people discovering they understand the same things from different angles. Pruitt watched this and said nothing, but by the end of it he was smiling slightly. When they left on the second afternoon, their packs held prepared soil amendment materials, seed starts from the rye and turnip beds, and 12 pages of notes in Marin's handwriting covering everything she had told them and several things she thought of in the night and added before dawn. She had written them knowing the notes would be read by more people than Pruitt and Pell, would be passed around and argued over and referenced by people who had never met her, and she had written them accordingly, clear and concrete and without assuming knowledge the reader might not have. Pruitt paused at the entrance slot before going through. He looked back at the cave one more time, at the rye beds and the moss wall and the small fire and the 2 sleeping mats and the tin cup on its hook. All of it built with a knife, an axe, a length of rope, and 112 days. "My wife asked me to tell you," he said, "that the bread we got in February was the best she'd eaten in 2 years. He went through the slot before Marin could find what to do with that which she thought was probably deliberate. She stood in the warmth of the cave and let it land. That small, ordinary, specific kindness. The best bread in 2 years. She felt something in her chest do something quiet that did not need to be large to be real. Della called from the secondary chamber. "What did he say?" "That his wife liked the bread." A pause. "That's nice," Della said. "Yes," Marin said. "It is." Spring did not arrive all at once. It never does in the upper mountain range, where winter releases its grip the way stubborn people release arguments, slowly, with reversals, with apparent progress followed by a late snow that makes you doubt the season has turned at all. There was a storm in what should have been early March that put new snow in the ravine and dropped the temperature back to midwinter levels for nearly a week. Marin lay on her sleeping mat the second night of it and felt the cave hold its warmth around her and thought, "This is still enough. Whatever happens outside, this is still enough." The storm broke. The melt began again. Water running in the ravine in thin, cold threads that thickened over the following weeks into something with real current. Snow on the ravine walls receding by inches and then by feet. One morning, Della went out to check the snare line and came back without going to the snares at all. She stood just inside the entrance with an expression Marin had not seen in months. "Come outside," Della said. She came outside. The sky above the ravine was blue. Not the flat, pressurized blue of cold, clear days, but the particular deep blue that means the season has actually decided to change this time. The blue that has warmth behind it. Above the rim, somewhere in the spruce, a bird was making noise. A real bird, not a cold weather bird, something that had come back for a reason. They stood in the ravine and looked up. 138 days, Marin said. "You've been counting." "I've always been counting." Della tipped her head back further, looking at the blue. "We should go down," she said. "Not urgently, simply. I know. Not today, but soon. I know that too." They stood in the ravine in the early spring light and listened to the bird and the water and the sound of the mountain deciding slowly and without ceremony to be warm again. They went down 11 days later. Not forever. They were clear about that with each other and did not need to say it at length. The cave was not a place they were leaving. It was a place they were expanding from. It was the center of something now, a working system, that still needed tending and would need it through the spring planting season and beyond. They were not abandoning it. They were choosing for the first time to move between it and the world below. Caleb walked down with them. He had offered and they had accepted without making anything of it, because his knowing the route was practical, and because he had been the thread between the two worlds all winter, and it was fitting that he be the one to walk them back. The path down was different from the path up, physically different. The trail they had broken in January had been swallowed by months of snow, and what they walked now was the proper spring version of the same route, the creek bed audible below the trees opening ahead to show the valley. But it was different in another way, too, in the way that had nothing to do with the trail and everything to do with the people walking it, who were not the same people who had walked it in the other direction on a January morning with 2 packs and 5 days of dried meat. Marin thought about this as she walked, about what changes a person and what doesn't. She thought about the version of herself who had stood in a doorway and looked at her uncle's face, and filed away the expression she found there. And she thought about the version of herself who had sat across a fire from that same man and told him to carry the medicine back and read the instructions twice. What had happened in the space between those two moments was that she had found out what she was built for, not in the triumphant sense. Not the story of a person who discovers her strength and is thereafter whole and untroubled by the things that troubled her before. Life did not tell that kind of story. What she had found out was quieter and more durable than that. She had found out that when her full capacity was engaged in a real problem with real stakes, in conditions that did not forgive mistakes, she did not break. She bent, and she got tired, and she was afraid sometimes in the night, and she lost her temper over soil quality, and she cried once on day 23 when the water stopped and she could not immediately see how to restore it. All of those things, and she kept going. That was not a small thing to know about yourself. Drayfield looked the same from the trail above it, and different when she walked into it. The same in the ways small mountain towns are always the same. The layout, the buildings, the mill, the particular way the main street ran between the two tallest structures and caught the afternoon light. Different in the way a place looks when you have been away from it long enough to see it, rather than simply recognize it. Mrs. Pruitt was in her doorway when they came down the main street. She looked at Marin and Della with an expression so direct and uncomplicated in its relief that it was almost startling. "You're all right," she said. Not a question. A confirmation of something she had needed to confirm. "We're all right," Marin said. The youngest Pruitt girl was on her mother's hip, the one who had been sick in February, the one whose fever had broken on the third day after the Moss compound arrived. She looked at Marin with the frank, unguarded assessment of a very small child, and then hid her face in her mother's collar and then looked again. Peldanzi was across the street with two other men, and he nodded when he saw them, the nod of someone who has shared real work with a person and feels the work established, something that doesn't require more words than that. Marin nodded back. Mrs. Aldine came out of her house 3 doors down, small and sharp-eyed, moving, with the careful deliberateness of someone recently recovered who is still finding the full edges of her capacity. She looked at both sisters with the professional assessment of a woman who had spent 30 years looking at people and seeing past whatever surface they were presenting. "The Cave Moss compound," she said by way of greeting. "Our mother's formulation," Marin said. "She was a careful woman." "She was." "I'd like to understand the preparation properly, when you have time." "I'll make time," Marin said, and meant it immediately and completely. Edmund Holt was at the far end of the street. He had not come forward when she arrived. He stood at his end and watched, giving her the choice, which was the first actively right thing he had done in a long sequence of wrong ones, and she gave it the credit it deserved. She walked toward him. Up close, he looked older than January. Not just the winter. The specific aging that happens when a person has been forced to see themselves clearly and has not been able to look away. He stood straight, but the straightness was effort rather than ease. He watched her come and did not change his expression because whatever was on his face had been there long enough to settle. She stopped in front of him. "The sketchbook got there," he said. "It did. It was always—" He stopped. "It was hers, and then it was yours. It should have been yours from the beginning." "Yes," she said simply. He looked at the ground for a moment, then back at her face. "Thomas Colburn says the South Meadow site should be workable by mid-April. He's already started the soil amendment." "I know," Pruitt wrote to tell me. "A lot of people think you should be the one teaching the spring planting method, actually teaching it, not just writing it down." "I know that too." He was quiet. She let him be quiet. She had not come to this end of the street to make it easier for him. But she had not come to make it harder either. She had come because the sketchbook deserved acknowledgement, and because her mother would have thought it mattered to acknowledge it, and because she had spent 4 months building something real in a cave on the mountain above this town, and the reality of what she had built had given her a kind of solidity she intended to keep. "I don't know how to fix it," he said, not asking for help, just being honest, which was something he was learning to do. "You can't fix it," she said. "You can do better with what's in front of you. That's all anyone can do with the things they've already done wrong." He looked at her. His jaw worked. You sound like your mother." "Good," she said. She was usually right. She held his look for one more moment. Then she turned and walked back up the street to where Della was standing with Caleb and Mrs. Aldine talking about the cave moss preparation in the practical, focused way of people who have identified a problem they intend to solve together, and she walked into that conversation and let it take her. The South Meadow cold frame went in on the 14th of April. Marin's design, Pruitt's labor, Peldancy's soil preparation. And by the end of the first week, there were 11 people working it, learning the amendment ratios, learning to read light conditions, learning the difference between soil that was ready and soil that needed more time. Marin moved among them and answered questions and corrected mistakes without making the corrections feel like failures the way her mother had done with her. And when the first seedlings broke the surface of the meadow bed and the person who had planted them crouched down to look, Marin felt the same satisfaction she had felt in the cave on the 18th morning watching Della angle the reflector those final 10 degrees. The thing about teaching, she was finding, was that it multiplied what you knew. Not in the abstract sense of spreading knowledge, though that was true too, but in the specific sense that explaining a thing required understanding it more completely than simply doing it. The questions people asked pushed her to understand her own methods more precisely than she'd had to when it was just her and Della in the cave working by firelight. Della said one morning as they walked down from the cave together and stood at the meadow plot edge watching the work, "You're better at it than I thought you'd be. The teaching, with people, you were always careful in town. I was afraid of making things worse. I know, but you're not doing that now." Marin watched Pell explaining the reflector angle to a younger man who was listening with the focused attention of someone who has decided this matters. "I think I stopped worrying about whether they liked me," she said. "Somewhere in the cave I stopped having the energy for it and I never quite picked it back up." Della was quiet for a moment. "That might be the most useful thing the winter gave you." "The winter gave us a lot of things." It did. But most of them required the hard part first. That was the truest thing that could be said about it. They both knew it. And they stood at the edge of the meadow in the April light and let it be true without adding anything to it, because some things are complete as they are and require nothing further from the people who live them.